Welcome to Hearths of Myths. Today, the golden sun sinks behind the dunes, and the air grows cool with the scent of river reeds and ancient incense. We are walking the complete path of the Lord of Eternity, the Green God, Osiris. Close your eyes, settle in, and let the river of time carry you home. In the time before the first sunrise, before the word for yesterday had even been conceived, there was only Nun. Nun was not a god in the way we understand divinity, but a vast, silent, and shoreless ocean of primordial potential. It was a dark, cool abyss where every possibility of life lay dormant, like seeds waiting for a rain that had not yet fallen. Imagine a silence so profound that even a heartbeat would have sounded like a thunderclap. Within this watery chaos, the first consciousness began to stir. This was Atum, the All, who willed himself into existence simply by acknowledging his own being. As Atum rose from the dark waters onto the first mound of dry land, the Benben stone, the universe felt its first pulse. From Atum's solitary existence came the first breath and the first moisture, Shu and Tefnut, and from their union the world gained its floor and its ceiling. Geb, the god of the earth, and Nut, the goddess of the sky. In those earliest eons, Geb and Nut were locked in an eternal, inseparable embrace. There was no space between the dark soil of the earth and the starlit belly of the sky. No air could circulate, no light could penetrate, and thus no life could flourish. They were two halves of a single soul, a divine unity that defied the need for distance. Yet, the Creator, often identified as Ra, the sun who had emerged from Atum's glory, saw that this union prevented the unfolding of the cosmic plan. He commanded their father, Shu, the god of air, to stand between them. With a heave that shattered the silence of the young world, Shu thrust his arms upward, lifting Nut high above her brother. Geb remained below, his body forming the mountains and valleys, while Nut arched over him, her skin becoming the firmament where the stars would eventually find their home. But the separation did not come without a price. Nut was already pregnant, carrying a burden of divinity that would shape the destiny of the Nile Valley. Ra, sensing that Nut's offspring might one day challenge his own celestial authority, grew fearful and vengeful. In a voice that rattled the foundations of the newly formed heavens, he pronounced a devastating curse. Nut would not be allowed to give birth on any day of any month of the year. In the ancient Egyptian calendar, this was a total prohibition. The year consisted of exactly 12 months, each 30 days long, totaling 360 days. By forbidding her to labor on any of these days, Ra intended to trap the unborn gods within her womb forever, ensuring his throne would never be contested. Nut's sorrow was as vast as the sky she personified. Her tears were said to be the evening dew, falling upon the dry skin of Geb in a silent plea for comfort. It was in this moment of divine despair that Thoth, the ibis-headed lord of wisdom, magic, and time, decided to intervene. Thoth was the scribe of the gods, the one who measured the movements of the stars and the vibrations of the soul. He knew that the cosmic law must be respected, but he also knew that magic lived in the spaces between the laws. Thoth did not approach Ra directly, for power is rarely moved by pity. Instead, he sought out Khonsu, the ancient god of the moon, who in those primeval nights shone with a brilliance that rivaled the sun itself. Thoth, ever the strategist, challenged Khonsu to a game of senet, a game of chance and skill played with carved pieces on a grid. The stakes were nothing less than the light of the moon itself. Khonsu, confident in his celestial glow, accepted. Round after round, under the watchful gaze of the shifting constellations, Thoth's intellect outmatched the moon's confidence. With every victory, Thoth took a fraction of Khonsu's light, exactly 1/72nd part of each day. By the end of their long, silent gamble, Thoth had accumulated enough moonlight to create 5 entirely new days. These 5 days, however, occupied a unique position in the fabric of time. Because they were won from the moon and not granted by the sun, they did not belong to the official 360 days of the year. They were epagomenal days, days that sat outside the calendar, lingering in a liminal space where Ra's curse held no power. As the old year drew to a close and the new one waited to be born, these 5 shadow days emerged. It was during this sacred window that Nut finally found relief. On the first day, the world felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense of gravity and grace that had never existed before. From the womb of the sky goddess, Osiris was born. Legend tells us that at the moment of his birth, a great voice echoed throughout the temples of Egypt, and perhaps even into the hearts of the wild creatures in the marshes, crying out, "The Lord of all has come forth into the light." Osiris was the firstborn, the heir to the earth, a being of such immense serenity that his skin was often depicted as the color of the fertile silt or the green of sprouting grain. He was the promise of order in a world that was still learning how to exist. On the second day came Horus the Elder, a magnificent being of the heights, whose eyes were the sun and the moon. On the third day, the atmosphere turned turbulent and violent. Set was born, but not in the gentle manner of his siblings. Impatient and aggressive even in the womb, Set tore his way through his mother's side, emerging as a god of storms, red sands, and the wild, unpredictable places of the world. He was the necessary shadow to Osiris's light, the chaos that tests the strength of order. On the fourth day, Isis was born, a goddess whose name meant throne, and whose heart held the secrets of all magic. She was the intellect and the compassion that would eventually hold the kingdom together. Finally, on the 5th day, Nephthys was born, the lady of the house and the guardian of the hidden things, the one who would stand at the edge of life and death, offering her wings as a shroud for those who passed beyond. These 5 children, the last generation of the great Ennead of Heliopolis, represented the full spectrum of the human and divine experience. They were siblings, but they were also archetypes. Osiris, however, was the one designated for the throne. From his first breath, he was the king of the living, the one who would bridge the gap between the distant, fiery majesty of Ra and the tangible, dusty reality of the people of the Nile. As the 5 days ended and the sun rose on the first day of the official new year, the world had changed forever. The gods were no longer just distant concepts in the void. They were a family, and their story was about to become the story of Egypt itself. The early days of Osiris's life were spent under the tutelage of Thoth, learning the rhythms of the cosmos and the secrets of the hieroglyphs. He watched as the Nile flooded and receded, noticing how the earth responded to the gift of water. He saw his sister Isis and knew, with a certainty that transcended the physical, that they were bound together by a destiny that would endure even the destruction of the stars. While Set roamed the scorching deserts, finding kinship with the scorpions and the dry winds, Osiris stayed near the river, listening to the reeds and the soil. This period of Egyptian myth is often called the Golden Age, or Zep Tepi, the first time. It was an era when the gods walked among men, not as terrifying specters, but as teachers and protectors. There was a sense of profound harmony, a alignment of the earthly realm with the celestial Mat. Mat was more than just a goddess of truth. She was the concept of cosmic balance, the idea that everything has its proper place and its proper time. Osiris was the living embodiment of Mat. Under his gaze, the harshness of the primordial world began to soften. The people who had been living in fear and lawlessness looked toward the horizon and saw a king who did not rule through the edge of a blade, but through the wisdom of the heart. Yet, even in this era of perfection, the seeds of the great tragedy were being sown. Set, watching from the red dunes of the high desert, felt a cold knot of jealousy tightening in his chest. He saw how the people whispered Osiris's name with love. He saw how the green earth flourished under his brother's feet while the desert remained barren. Set did not understand that the desert was his own beauty. He only saw that it was not the throne. The duality of Egypt, the red land and the black land, was mirrored in the hearts of these two brothers. One was the fertile, predictable flood that brought life. The other was the sudden, violent sandstorm that could bury a city in an afternoon. As Osiris prepared to take his place as the first true pharaoh of humanity, the world held its breath. He was the son of Geb and Nut, the grandson of Shu and Tefnut, and the great-grandson of the Creator himself. He carried the blood of the stars and the dust of the earth in equal measure. His reign was destined to be a bridge, a path leading humanity away from the animal instincts of the past and toward a future where the soul could be weighed against a feather. But before he could rule the underworld, he had to rule the earth. And it is in this earthly reign that we see the true character of the god, who would eventually become the Lord of eternity. When Osiris stepped onto the throne of Egypt, he did not find a nation of grand temples and organized cities. Instead, the legends tell us that he inherited a people living in a state of primal chaos. In those ancient times, humanity was scattered along the banks of the Nile, living more like the predators of the marshes than the architects of civilization. They were a people without laws, without agriculture, and, most hauntingly, they were often driven to cannibalism by the sheer desperation of their hunger. The world was a place of raw survival, where the strong devoured the weak, and the spirit of man was as wild and untamed as the flooding river itself. Osiris, alongside his queen and sister Isis, looked upon this scene not with disgust, but with a profound paternal compassion. He was Un-Nefer, the Good One, and his first mission was to elevate humanity from the dust. He began by addressing the most fundamental of all human needs, the need for sustenance that did not require the shedding of blood. Osiris walked into the fields and, using his divine connection to his father Geb, the earth god, he discovered the secrets hidden within the soil. He showed the people how to recognize the wild grasses that we now know as emmer wheat and barley. He taught them that the earth was not a silent tomb, but a generous mother that would provide for them if they only knew how to listen to her cycles. The introduction of the plow was a turning point in the history of the world. Osiris himself is said to have fashioned the first one, showing how the strength of the ox could be harnessed to turn the heavy river silt, preparing a bed for the golden seeds. He taught the art of irrigation, showing the villagers how to dig canals that would lead the life-giving waters of the Nile into the parched backlands. For the first time, the people did not have to wait in fear for the flood to end. They could manage the water, storing the surplus for the lean months of summer. Under his guidance, the valley transformed. The chaotic marshes were cleared, and in their place grew vast, shimmering fields of grain that swayed in the breeze like a golden ocean. But Osiris knew that bread alone was not enough to create a civilization. A society requires a soul, a sense of shared purpose, and a framework of justice. Thus, he introduced the first laws. These were not the arbitrary commands of a tyrant, but the principles of Ma'at, translated into human language. He taught the people the value of a promise, the sacredness of property, and the necessity of truth. He showed them that a community is built on the trust that one man will not take what another has earned through his labor. He established the first temples, showing humanity how to honor the gods, not out of terror, but as an act of reciprocity. The gods provided the sun and the rain. The people provided the incense and the prayers. This was the cosmic contract that Osiris signed on behalf of humanity. While Osiris focused on the fields and the halls of justice, Isis was equally active in the transformation of the land. She was the mistress of the domestic arts, the one who turned a shelter into a home. She taught the women how to take the fibers of the flax plant and weave them into the cool white linen that would become the signature of Egyptian elegance. She showed them how to grind the grain between heavy stones to produce the flour for bread. But perhaps her most beloved gift was the secret of medicine. Isis knew the properties of every herb and the vibrations of every spoken spell. She taught the people how to heal the sick, how to set broken bones, and how to ease the passing of the elderly. Together, Osiris and Isis were the perfect duality of leadership, the provider and the protector, the lawgiver and the healer. The cultural impact of Osiris's reign extended into the very vessels from which the Egyptians drank. It is said that Osiris was the one who first instructed the people in the craft of brewing beer. He showed them how to take the surplus barley, ferment it with the sacred waters of the Nile, and create a drink that nourished the body and lightened the heart. This was not merely about intoxication. In the ancient world, beer was a primary source of nutrition, a liquid bread that was safe to drink when the water of the river was murky. He also introduced the cultivation of the vine, showing how the grapes of the delta could be pressed into the dark, rich wine that would be used in the most sacred of temple rituals. These gifts were seen as manifestations of his own life force, the divine essence that made the world green and vibrant. As the fame of Egypt's prosperity grew, Osiris did not remain secluded in a palace. He was a king of the world, driven by a desire to bring this newfound order to every corner of the earth, leaving Isis to rule in his stead, which she did with an intelligence that silenced even the most skeptical of critics. Osiris traveled beyond the borders of Egypt. He did not lead an army of soldiers with spears and shields. Instead, he was followed by a procession of musicians, poets, and teachers. He conquered the neighboring lands through the power of song and the compelling logic of civilization. Wherever he went, he planted vineyards, dug wells, and shared the secrets of agriculture. He was the great civilizer, a figure of such immense charisma that even the most warlike tribes laid down their weapons in his presence. During this absence, Isis managed the kingdom with a firm and graceful hand. She maintained the canals, oversaw the harvests, and ensured that the laws of Osiris were upheld. She was the living throne, the stability that allowed her husband to be the spirit of expansion. However, this period of peace was also the time when the shadow of Set began to lengthen. While the world celebrated Osiris's return from his travels, Set was in the darkness, plotting a move that would end the Golden Age forever. Set did not care about bread. He did not care about music. He saw the world as a place of raw power, and in his eyes, Osiris had become soft, a king of gardeners and singers who had forgotten the primal fire of the desert. The tragedy of Osiris is often seen as a conflict of morality, but it was also a conflict of nature. Osiris represented the Black Land, Kemet, the fertile, predictable, and life-giving silt of the Nile Valley. Set represented the Red Land, Deshret, the scorched, unpredictable, and dangerous expanse of the desert. In the Egyptian mind, both were necessary, but they had to be kept in balance. By attempting to make the whole world green and civilized, Set felt that Osiris was erasing the necessary chaos of the universe. This was the philosophical justification for his betrayal, but beneath it lay a much simpler and more ancient motive: the craving for the crown. When Osiris finally returned to Egypt, a great feast was prepared in his honor. The people lined the riverbanks, throwing palm fronds into the water and singing hymns of thanksgiving. The king was home. He was taller than any mortal, his presence radiating a light that seemed to come from within. His skin, according to some texts, had taken on the deep, lustrous black of the richest soil, a sign of his absolute union with the land he ruled. He was the Lord of the West and the Prince of the living, a being who had successfully tamed the wild heart of humanity. At this feast, held in the cooling shadows of a summer evening, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, fresh bread, and the heavy perfume of lotus blossoms. Musicians played the harp and the sistrum, their melodies weaving through the laughter of the assembled gods and nobles. Osiris sat at the head of the table, his arm around Isis, unaware that among the 72 conspirators seated in the hall, his own brother held a weapon that could not be fought with a song. Set had commissioned a chest, a masterpiece of cedar and gold, that would soon become the most famous coffin in the history of the world. The transition from the Golden Age to the era of the Great Mystery began here. Osiris had taught man how to live. Now, through his own suffering, he was about to teach them how to die, and more importantly, how to hope for what lay beyond the tomb. His earthly reign had provided the physical foundations of Egypt, the grain, the laws, the white linen. But his upcoming sacrifice would provide the spiritual architecture of the human soul. The story of the good king was ending, and the story of the eternal judge was about to begin. Every grain of wheat that falls into the earth and dies, only to rise again as a green shoot, would forever be a reminder of this moment, the moment when the light of the first time began to fade into the twilight of the first betrayal. The transition from the light of the Golden Age to the long shadow of the first betrayal began with a silence that felt heavier than a storm. Set, the lord of the red sands and the unpredictable gale, had spent years watching his brother Osiris from the periphery of the fertile valley. To Set, The prosperity of Egypt was a stagnant pool. He craved the movement of the wind and the raw, unrefined power of the desert. His jealousy was not a sudden spark, but a slow-burning fire that consumed his heart until only the ash of resentment remained. He saw Osiris as a king who had domesticated the world, forgetting that life often requires the harshness of the sun to truly understand the value of the shade. Set's plan was a masterpiece of cold, calculated precision. He knew that Osiris could not be defeated through a simple trial of strength, for the king was protected by the love of the people and the watchful magic of Isis. To destroy a god, one must use the god's own virtues against him. Set chose the virtue of appreciation. He gathered 72 conspirators, a number that reflected the division of the celestial degrees and the processional cycles of the stars. The air within the Wabet, the place of purification, was thick with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, a cool stillness that stood in defiance of the chaotic heat of the desert outside. Here, the fractured divinity of Osiris lay upon a table of polished alabaster, 14 fragments gathered from the corners of Egypt, waiting for the touch that would bridge the gap between a broken corpse and an eternal spirit. It was at this critical juncture, when the magic of Isis and Nephthys had reached its threshold, that Anubis, the jackal-headed lord of the shadows, stepped from the darkness to assume his role as the master of the mortuary arts. He did not approach the task as a mere physician, but as a divine architect, tasked with reconstructing the vessel of a god whose violent death had threatened to unravel the very foundations of cosmic order. Anubis was the guardian of the threshold, the one who understood that for a soul to be eternal, its earthly house had to be made indestructible. Anubis began his unprecedented work by examining each recovered fragment with a supernatural perception that revealed wounds far deeper than the physical cuts of Set's blade. He saw the spiritual scars where the divine essence had been severed from its material anchor, and he understood that conventional joining would not suffice for the king of the Black Land. Each piece of Osiris's body contained memories, specific divine attributes, and the echoes of his benevolent reign. To reassemble him was to reassemble the history of the world itself. The head, with its familiar features that had once radiated royal grace, now bore the confusion of a violent end, and the torso, which had housed the heart, the seat of intelligence and moral judgment, required the most delicate care to ensure that Osiris's wisdom would survive the transition into the halls of eternity. He moved with a precision that was both terrifying and beautiful, his long, dark fingers tracing the lines of the god's cold skin, as if reading a map of the universe. The process of reassembly was a symphony of ritual and technique. Anubis employed binding methods that operated on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. He used a golden thread, spun from metal blessed by the sun, God Ra himself, to stitch the fragments together, ensuring that solar power would maintain the connections throughout the eons. Every stitch was accompanied by a specific incantation, a spoken vibration that acted as a spiritual glue. To seal the joints, he developed complex adhesives created from sacred resins gathered from trees in hidden oases, combined with blessed oils and pulverized precious stones like lapis lazuli and carnelian. These materials, gathered from temples throughout the length of the Nile, became the foundation for all future embalming preparations, imbuing the organic compounds with a preservative power that defied the passage of time and the rot of the earth. The smell of the resins, sharp, sweet, and ancient, filled the chamber, acting as a barrier against the forces of decay. As the body began to take shape once more, Anubis positioned the restored form according to precise astronomical principles. He oriented the corpse with its head pointing toward the circumpolar stars, those eternal lights in the northern sky that never set, to guarantee a connection to the imperishable realm of existence. The arms were crossed over the chest in a posture of royal dignity, the hands prepared to grasp the crook and flail that symbolized authority over both the living and the dead. This specific orientation ensured that the spiritual channels connecting the limbs to the heart remained open, allowing divine will to flow through the restored body once the final resurrection was achieved in the depths of the Duat. Every angle of the body was measured against the geometry of the heavens, ensuring that Osiris was not just a mummy, but a celestial map. The preservation phase demanded a mastery of the elements that few could fathom. Anubis began the first stage of divine evisceration, carefully removing the internal organs with tools forged from meteoric iron, the metal known as the bones of the gods. Unlike the practices for mortals, where organs were sometimes discarded, each of Osiris's organs was treated as a sacred entity, requiring individual consecration. The lungs, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines were purified with palm wine and precious spices, then placed within 4 specialized containers, the prototypes for the canopic jars. These vessels, crafted from materials that shimmered with an inner light, were placed under the protection of the 4 sons of Horus, Imseti, Hapi, Duamutef, and Kebesenuef. Even the heart was removed, purified with special preservatives, and returned to its place within the chest cavity, for it was essential that the seat of the soul be present for the final weighing in the halls of Maat. Then came the long desiccation, a period of 70 days that synchronized the physical transformation with the cycles of the heavens. Anubis used enormous quantities of natron salt, the naturally occurring sodium carbonate collected from the Wadi Natrun. This mineral, blessed through elaborate rituals to enhance its preservative magic, drew the moisture from the divine flesh while protecting it from both physical decay and spiritual corruption. Throughout these 70 days, Anubis performed daily ceremonies, burning frankincense and myrrh to maintain the bridge between the preserved body and the god's temporarily departed essence. The scent of these resins, heavy and ancient, acted as a spiritual anchor, preventing the soul from wandering too far into the mists of the underworld before the body was ready to receive it once more. The 70 days were a period of gestation, a second pregnancy in the womb of the earth. When the 70 days were complete, the natron was removed to reveal a body that was perfectly preserved but required restoration to its divine luster. Anubis applied a complex mixture of cedar oil from the mountains of Lebanon, frankincense from the land of Punt, and aromatic substances like palm wine and honey. These fluids penetrated the desiccated tissues, restoring their natural color and providing the dark, lustrous appearance that the Egyptians associated with fertility, rebirth, and the rich silt of the Nile. This stage was not just about preservation. It was the creation of the Sa, the glorified spiritual body that could navigate the realms of the gods without fear of dissolution. The skin of Osiris began to glow with a deep emerald darkness, a sign that the life force of the earth was beginning to stir within him again. The final wrapping established the intricate bandaging techniques that would define Egyptian culture for 3,000 years. Anubis used hundreds of yards of fine linen, woven from flax grown in sacred fields and blessed by temple priestesses. As he wrapped the body, He placed numerous protective amulets between the layers of cloth, each positioned with mathematical precision. The Jed pillar, representing the spine of Osiris and the concept of stability, was positioned to ensure the body would never again be broken by the storms of Set. The Tiet, or the knot of Isis, was placed over the heart to provide the protection of the goddess's blood and magic. The Ankh, the symbol of life, was placed at the throat to ensure that the breath of eternity could always find a path into the restored form. Each layer of linen was a layer of safety, a woven prayer that held the fragments of the god in a tight, loving embrace. Anubis worked with a focus that excluded the rest of the world. He did not eat or sleep during the most critical phases of the wrapping, his jackal senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the divine energy. Every tool he used, the bronze knives, the specialized hooks, and the ceremonial adzes, became consecrated implements that would be replicated by every mortal embalmer thereafter. By the time the final resinous coating was applied to seal the wrappings, Osiris was no longer a collection of scattered remains. He was a unified, indestructible monument to the victory of order over chaos. He was the first mummy, the prototype for all who hoped to survive the grave. This first divine mummification provided the template for the Egyptian hope of eternal life, proving that through the correct application of divine knowledge and the loyal care of those left behind, death was not an end, but a transformation into something imperishable and magnificent. The completion of the wrappings did not mean the end of the ritual. Anubis stood over the silent form of Osiris for many hours, reciting the final protective spells that would seal the Sa against the intrusions of malevolent spirits. He spoke to the limbs, the eyes, and the heart, telling them that they were now part of a celestial reality. He reminded the god of his own name and his own power, preparing him for the journey through the 12 hours of the night. The jackal god's work was done, but his vigil would continue. He would remain the guardian of the tomb, the one who stood between the light and the dark, ensuring that the good being could rest in peace until the moment of his final awakening. As the sun began to rise on the 71st day, the Wabet was opened to the priests and the weeping sisters. They saw before them not a broken corpse, but a king of gold and linen, a figure of such immense dignity that the sorrow of his death was momentarily eclipsed by the awe of his preservation. Osiris was ready to descend into the Duat, not as a victim, but as a conqueror of the void. The sacred art of mummification had turned a tragedy into a ritual of hope, and the secrets that Anubis had discovered in the darkness of the embalming house would become the most precious inheritance of the Egyptian people. They would spend the next 3 millennia trying to replicate this moment, building pyramids and carving tombs to house the Sa that Anubis had first created. The Lord of the West was now prepared to claim his kingdom, and the path to the stars was finally open. While the body of Osiris was being transformed into the first mummy under the watchful eyes of Anubis, the goddess Isis found herself facing a challenge that defied the very laws of the physical world. The 14th piece of her husband, the symbol of his generative power, had been consumed by the fish of the Nile and was lost to the realm of matter forever. This was more than a personal grief. It was a theological crisis that threatened the continuity of the divine kingship and the future of Egypt. Without an heir born of the union of the true king and queen, the throne would remain in the violent hands of Set, and the cycles of Maat would remain broken. It was here, in the depths of her sorrow and the height of her power, that Isis performed the most famous act of magic in antiquity. She did not weep for what was lost. She willed into existence what was necessary. She fashioned a replacement for the missing part from gold and sacred wax, imbuing it with a life force through incantations that only the mistress of words could utter. Then, as the mummification reached its spiritual climax, Isis and her sister Nephthys transformed themselves into kites, birds of prey with wide, dark wings. They hovered over the reassembled body of Osiris, their wings beating the air with a rhythmic intensity that was said to create the breath of life itself. The sound of these wings was a low, steady drumbeat that resonated with the heartbeat of the earth. Through this combination of mechanical action and metaphysical intent, Isis drew the spirit of Osiris back into his preserved form for a single, fleeting moment. In this liminal space, between the silence of the tomb and the promise of the stars, the miracle of conception took place. It was a union that transcended death, a moment where the eternal love of the goddess reached into the void and pulled forth the seed of the future. As the divine light of Osiris faded back into the shadows of the underworld, Isis felt the pulse of a new life within her. She knew, however, that the palace was no longer safe, and that the kingdom of Set offered no sanctuary for the son of his rival. Carrying the royal burden in secret, Isis fled to the labyrinthine reaches of the Nile Delta, a place known as Shemis, or the Floating Island. This was a world of shifting water and emerald reeds, where the papyrus grew to such heights that it obscured the sky and the mist hung heavy over the hidden channels. It was a landscape of concealment, protected by the very nature of its wildness from the searching eyes of Set's desert spies. The air here was thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming lotus, a place where the boundaries between the land and the water were as fluid as the boundaries between the gods and men. Isis's time in the marshes was a period of profound solitude and divine maternal focus. She was not alone in her vigil. The legends tell us that she was guarded by 7 scorpions: Tephen, Bephen, Mestet, Mestetef, Petet, Thetet, and Matet, who formed a protective ring around her, their stings ready for any who dared to disturb the goddess. These scorpions were not merely animals, but spiritual guardians, each representing a different layer of defense against the poisons of chaos. They followed her as she walked through the shallow waters, their tails raised in warning, a silent army of the desert serving the queen of the river. This era of the myth highlights the vulnerability of the divine, as the mother of the future king was forced to live like a fugitive among the mud and the reeds, begging for bread in the nearby villages while hiding her true majesty under the simple worn garments of a peasant woman. When the time arrived for the birth of Horus, the atmosphere of the marshes changed. The herons stood silent, their long necks frozen against the twilight, and the very wind seemed to cease its rustling of the papyrus. Horus was born, not as a simple child, but as the avenger of his father and the legitimate heir to the throne of the 2 lands. His birth was the fulfillment of the promise made by the stars during the first days of creation. Yet, the infant was fragile, and the marshes were filled with dangers both natural and supernatural. It is said that Horus was often plagued by the stings of insects and the bites of serpents, representing the attempts of chaos to stifle the light of order before it could grow into its full power. Isis spent her nights and days leaning over the cradle of reeds, whispering spells of healing and protection, her magic the only wall between the child and the hunger of Set. During these trials, the role of Anubis shifted once more. Though he was the guardian of the dead, he recognized that his duty to Osiris extended to the protection of his son. Anubis emerged from the shadows of the cemetery boundaries to serve as a silent guardian for the child in the wetlands. His keen senses, capable of detecting threats from miles away, monitored the movements of Set's agents, and his presence ensured that the secret of the child's existence remained hidden from the usurper. This established a complex family dynamic that reflected the deeper themes of Egyptian theology. Nephthys's son, Anubis, protecting the son of Isis, Horus, creating a unified front against the destructive forces of their own kin. The jackal and the falcon were bound by a blood oath that predated the foundations of the temples. Isis's maternal love transcended the grievances of the past. She chose to raise Horus with a focus on his eventual destiny, teaching him the names of the gods and the secrets of the kingship, while Anubis taught him the necessity of vigilance and the understanding of the boundaries between the worlds. The relationship between Horus and Anubis became one of brotherhood and mutual purpose. Anubis was the elder protector, the one who had handled the remains of the past, while Horus was the active force of the future. Horus learned to listen to the whispers of the reeds and the movements of the stars, guided by a mother who was a queen in exile and a brother who was a god of the tomb. He grew up in the shadows of the great papyrus stalks, his playground the mud that Osiris had once blessed, his teachers the ancient spirits of the Delta. The birth of Horus in the marshes was the turning point for the reign of Set. The news of a survivor, a living Osiris in the form of a son, began to trickle out of the Delta like a slow-moving flood. The people, who had endured the harshness of the desert king, began to look toward the north with a renewed sense of hope. The myth of the child in the papyrus became a symbol of the resilience of life and the inevitability of justice. Horus grew rapidly, nourished by the milk of Isis and the divine protection of his guardians. His eyes, one representing the sun and the other the moon, beginning to burn with the fire of his father's stolen authority. He was the promise that the Golden Age was not dead, but merely sleeping, waiting for the moment to strike back against the darkness. This period of the story serves as a bridge between the tragedy of death and the triumph of resurrection. It demonstrates that even when the body is wrapped in the silence of the tomb, the influence of the Good One continues to shape the world through his lineage. The marshes of Chemis, once a place of hiding, were becoming the staging ground for a cosmic war that would determine the fate of the universe. Isis, the great seeker, had become the great mother, and her victory in the hidden channels of the Delta was the first step toward the restoration of Ma'at. She showed that the power of a mother's love, combined with the ancient secrets of Heka, could overcome even the most absolute of endings. As Horus reached the threshold of manhood, the secret of the Delta could no longer be contained. The falcon was ready to take flight. The child, who had been bitten by serpents and hidden in the mud, was now a god of war and justice, his voice a thunderclap that echoed from the Mediterranean to the cataracts of the south. The stage was set for the great conflict between the falcon and the storm, a battle that would decide who truly held the right to sit upon the throne of Osiris and rule over the hearts of men. But before the battle could be joined, Horus had to visit the underworld in his dreams, to speak with the father he had never known in the flesh, but whose spirit flowed through his veins like the rising Nile. The story of the marshes is the story of the hidden potential within all of us, the idea that even in the darkest, dampest corners of our lives, a king can be born. It is a reminder that protection often comes from the most unlikely places, whether it be the sting of a scorpion or the shadow of a jackal. Osiris was gone, but through the magic of Isis, he was more present than ever. He was the future king, the rising sun, and the hope that lived in the heart of every Egyptian. The green of the marshes was the green of Osiris, and the growth of the child was the growth of the grain, proving once and for all that the cycle of life is a force that no god of chaos can ever truly break. The sun sinks beneath the horizon of the western desert, and as the golden light fades into a bruised purple, the world of the living enters its period of rest. But in the Egyptian mind, the setting of the sun was not an end. It was a grand opening. Beneath the earth, in a realm that mirrors the Nile Valley in its geography, but defies it in its physics, lies the Duat. This is the kingdom of Osiris, a place of shadows, glowing embers, and emerald waters where the soul must navigate a labyrinth of tests before it can achieve the status of an Ach, a transfigured spirit. To understand Osiris, one must understand this landscape, for he is the son of the Underworld, the silent king who waits at the end of every human journey. The journey into the Duat begins at the moment the physical heart stops beating, and the spiritual essence, the Ka and the Ba, detach from the mummified remains. The deceased finds themselves standing at the mouth of a great cavern in the west. The air here is different. It smells of ancient dust and the ozone of magic. There is no sun, yet there is a pervasive dim light that emanates from the walls of the underworld itself, a bioluminescence of the spirit. The soul is not alone. If the rituals were performed correctly, the shadow of Anubis is there to guide the initial steps, but the ultimate destination is the throne of Osiris, and the path is divided into 12 distinct regions, corresponding to the 12 hours of the night. The first hour is the entrance into the land of Saker. Here, the soul encounters a vast desert of shifting black sands. Unlike the desert of the living world, these sands do not reflect heat. They pulse with a rhythmic vibration, as if the earth itself were breathing. The deceased must speak the names of the guardians who stand at the first gate. In Egyptian theology, knowing a name is the ultimate form of power. To name a thing is to define it, to control it, and to prevent it from causing harm. As the soul whispers the secret appellations of the gatekeepers, the massive bronze portals creak open, revealing the subterranean Nile, a river of dark, crystalline water that carries the solar bark of Ra and the souls of the dead deeper into the mystery. As the second and third hours pass, the landscape of the Duat becomes increasingly lush, but also increasingly dangerous. The soul enters the fertile land and the waters of Osiris. Here, the river is lined with giant papyrus reeds that pulse with a soft green light. This is the realm where the agriculture Osiris taught the living is mirrored in the spiritual world. But the waters are filled with entities that test the resolve of the traveler. There are serpents with multiple heads that breathe fire into the path, and crocodiles whose scales are made of flint. These are not merely monsters, they are the manifestations of the soul's own fears and unresolved guilts. Osiris, as the lord of this realm, does not intervene directly. He is the destination, the gravitational pull of justice that draws the soul forward through the trials. By the fourth and fifth hours, the journey descends into the depths of the earthly cavern. The dim light fades into a near absolute darkness. This is the region of the hidden land, where the god Saker dwells in his mysterious, hawk-headed form. The soul must navigate narrow passages, where the walls are inscribed with the history of every life ever lived. The silence here is absolute, broken only by the sound of the subterranean river falling over distant cataracts. It is in this hour that the deceased feels the true weight of mortality. The distractions of the physical world are gone, and only the essential character of the individual remains. This is the preparation for the encounter with the King of the West. The 6th hour is the moment of cosmic union. Deep within the center of the Duat, the solar bark of Ra reaches its lowest point. Here, a profound mystery occurs. The spirit of the sun god Ra and the spirit of the underworld king Osiris merge for a brief, transcendent moment. This is the meeting of the two souls. In the Egyptian mind, this union is what provides the energy for the sun to rise again and for life to continue. It is a reminder that death and life are not opposites, but two phases of a single, eternal pulse. The deceased witnessing this union receives a burst of divine energy, a fortification for the final hours of the night. The skin of Osiris, often depicted as green like the sprouting grain, glows with an inner light that illuminates the entire middle region of the Duat. As the 7th hour begins, the greatest threat to the cosmic order emerges from the shadows. Apep, the serpent of chaos, coils himself around the river in an attempt to swallow the solar bark and trap all souls in eternal darkness. Apep is the antithesis of Osiris, where Osiris represents order, fertility, and the continuity of life. Apep represents the void, the unraveling of creation. The battle against Apep is a collective effort. The gods on the bark, the guardian spirits of the hours, and even the deceased soul must participate by reciting spells of protection. To pass the 7th hour is to prove that one is an ally of Maat, a defender of the light. The 8th, 9th, and 10th hours are regions of preparation and rejuvenation. The soul passes through halls where the blessed dead, those who have already achieved their place in the afterlife, dwell in eternal comfort. They tend to celestial gardens and drink from the waters of the Spirit. These spirits act as a silent audience, watching the newcomer with eyes that have seen the beginning of time. They are the Westerners, and Osiris is their foremost. To see them is to understand that the goal is near. The atmosphere here is one of anticipation, as the soul approaches the boundary of the final judgment. In the 11th hour, the soul sees the first faint glow of the coming dawn on the eastern horizon of the underworld. The river begins to speed up, carrying the travelers toward the grandest structure in the spiritual world. The geography of the Duat begins to open up, shifting from narrow caverns to a vast, open plain that seems to stretch into infinity. The air becomes cool and fragrant with the scent of lilies and frankincense. The deceased is no longer a trembling ghost. Through the journey of the night, they have been tempered and purified. They are ready to stand before the throne. The 12th hour is the transition. The solar bark prepares to emerge into the world of the living as the rising sun, but the deceased does not go with it. Their journey ends here, at the threshold of the Hall of Two Truths. They have navigated the darkness, faced the serpent, and spoke the names of the guardians. Now, they must face the king. Osiris waits in a chamber of absolute justice, where the silence is not empty, but filled with the presence of Maat. The journey through the hours of the night was the trial of the will. The trial of the heart is about to begin. Every step taken through the black sands and the emerald marshes has led to this single frozen moment in the presence of the Lord of Eternity. The Hall of Two Truths is an architectural manifestation of the divine mind, a space that exists outside of time and beyond the reach of the living. As the soul steps across the threshold, the scale of the chamber is overwhelming. The floor is made of pure, translucent alabaster that reflects the glow of the stars embedded in the deep blue ceiling. 42 massive pillars, each representing a province of Egypt and a specific moral law, stretch upward into the shadows. Between these pillars stand the 42 assessors, terrible and magnificent deities with the heads of hawks, crocodiles, lions, and snakes. They are the witnesses of history, the ones who have observed every secret action and every whispered thought of the person now standing in their center. At the far end of the hall, upon a throne carved from a single block of basalt, sits Osiris. He is wrapped in the pristine white linen of a mummy, yet his face and hands are a vibrant living green, the color of the Nile's resurrection. He holds the crook and flail, symbols of his absolute authority over the souls of men. He does not speak. His judgment is not rendered in words, but in the silence of his presence. Flanking him are his sisters, Isis and Nephthys, their dark wings partially unfurled in a gesture of eternal protection and watchful grace. They are the support of the king and the advocates for the soul, provided the soul has lived in accordance with the truth. The focal point of the hall is the Great Balance. This is a scale of perfect precision, constructed from gold and celestial wood. On one side of the scale, Anubis, the jackal-headed god, places the Ib, the heart of the deceased. In Egyptian thought, the heart was not merely an organ. It was the vessel of memory, the record of one's character, and the witness of one's deeds. It was the only part of the human being that could not lie to the gods. On the other side of the scale, the goddess Maat, or her representative, places a single white ostrich feather, the symbol of cosmic truth, balance, and harmony. This is the moment of the negative confession. The deceased must stand before the 42 assessors and address each one by their secret name. One by one, the soul declares its innocence of specific sins. I have not stolen. I have not told lies. I have not caused pain to others. I have not polluted the sacred waters of the river. This is not a plea for mercy, but a declaration of alignment. To speak these words in the Hall of Two Truths is a dangerous act. If a single word is false, the heart will grow heavy with the weight of the lie, and the scale will tip. The assessors watch with unblinking eyes, their divine perception cutting through any facade of righteousness. As the confession proceeds, Anubis kneels by the scales, his sensitive fingers adjusting the balance with a terrifying care. Thoth, the ibis-headed lord of wisdom, stands nearby with a reed pen and a palette of ink, ready to record the verdict in the eternal scrolls. The tension in the hall is a physical pressure. Near the base of the scales crouches Ammit, the devourer of the dead. She is a composite demon, the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. She is the manifestation of non-existence. She does not hunt the living. She waits for the hearts that are found wanting. To be consumed by Ammit is not to die, but to be erased from the fabric of the universe forever. The weighing of the heart is the climax of the Egyptian spiritual experience. It is the final answer to the question of what a human life is worth. If the heart is heavy with the burdens of cruelty, greed, and deceit, it will sink. The feather of Maat will rise, and the soul will be handed over to the jaws of the devourer. There is no appeal and no second chance. The failure of the heart is the failure of the soul's purpose to maintain the balance of the world. But if the heart is as light as the feather, if the individual has lived with compassion and integrity, the scales remain in a state of perfect equilibrium. When the balance is achieved, a profound shift occurs in the atmosphere of the hall. The silent, green-skinned king, Osiris, finally moves. He nods in recognition of a fellow traveler of Maat. Thoth announces the verdict. Makaru, true of voice. The deceased is no longer a mere human spirit. They are justified. They have passed through the fire and the shadow and have emerged as a being of light. Horus, the son of Osiris, then takes the hand of the justified soul and leads them toward his father's throne. This is the moment of ultimate homecoming, the reunion of the mortal spirit with its divine source. Osiris speaks the name of the justified one, and in doing so, he grants them the right to enter the field of reeds. This is the celestial paradise, a land that looks like the most beautiful parts of the Nile Delta, but without the labor, the heat, or the sorrow. In the field of reeds, the grain grows 7 cubits high, and the fruit is always ripe. The justified soul is given a plot of land to tend, but they are also given Ushapti figures, magical servants, who will perform any task required of them. It is a world of eternal peace, where the deceased lives among the gods and their own ancestors, forever under the protective gaze of Osiris. The Hall of Two Truths is more than a courtroom. It is the place where the human story becomes a divine one. Osiris, through his own death and resurrection, became the first to pass this test, and by doing so, he opened the way for all of humanity. He is the Lord of the West, not because he rules over corpses, but because he rules over the triumph of the heart. The green of his skin is the promise that even in the heart of the underworld, life is the ultimate reality. The scales of Maat are the guarantee that the universe is not a place of random chaos, but a place of profound and beautiful order. As the soul leaves the hall to enter the eternal light of the field of reeds, they look back one last time at the silent king on the basalt throne. Osiris remains, waiting for the next hour, the next soul, and the next heart. He is the stillness at the center of the turning world, the judge who knows the weight of every tear and the value of every act of kindness. The story of Osiris is the story of the belief that death is merely a gateway to a truth that is lighter than a feather and more enduring than the mountains of the earth. The rhythm of ancient Egypt was not dictated by the ticking of a mechanical clock or the shifting of artificial seasons, but by the steady, heavy pulse of the Nile River. To the people of the Black Land, the river was the very veins of the earth, and the water that flooded its banks every year was seen as the literal blood of Osiris. He was not merely a king of the dead who sat upon a distant, cold throne in the underworld. He was the green god, the lord of vegetation, and the hidden force that pushed every single blade of emmer wheat through the dark, sun-baked soil of the valley. This aspect of Osiris is perhaps the most intimate and pervasive, for it connected the high, complex theology of the afterlife with the daily survival of the humble farmer, the village baker, and the common man. Osiris was the fertility of the land itself, a divine presence that could be felt in the dampness of the earth and the coolness of the shade. When the Nile receded each year, leaving behind a thick, odorous layer of black silt, the Egyptians did not see simple mud. They saw the literal, life-giving flesh of their fallen king, ready to be transformed into the golden grain that would sustain the nation. The color black held a profound and paradoxically beautiful significance in this ancient world. While many modern cultures might associate black with the finality of the grave or the absence of hope, the Egyptians viewed it as the color of supreme potential and rebirth. It was the hue of the rich alluvial deposits that granted life to the desert, and thus Osiris was most often depicted in temple reliefs with skin as dark as the midnight river, or as vibrant as the spring leaves. This black Osiris represented the transformative power of decomposition and the sacredness of the earth's belly. Just as the jackal scavengers of Anubis were seen not as agents of destruction, but as guardians who navigated the process of decay to prepare for what came next, Osiris embodied the absolute belief that life must pass through the darkness of the earth to achieve its true, magnificent growth. This cycle of dying and renewal was not a metaphor to the Egyptians. It was a daily and yearly reality that governed every cosmic and human existence, from the rising of the sun to the sprouting of a seed. Every year, as the heat of the summer reached its peak and the earth began to crack under the relentless, fiery gaze of the sun, the Egyptians performed the ancient ritual of the Osiris bed. This was an act of profound, sympathetic magic that blurred the lines between agriculture and religion. In the dark, cool chambers of the great temples, or sometimes within the quiet confines of the tombs themselves, priests would fashion a wooden frame in the precise shape of the god. They would fill this frame with a mixture of the sacred, moist silt taken directly from the riverbed, and a carefully measured amount of grain, barley or emmer wheat. They would water this Osiris of earth with the same reverence and care they gave to the golden statues in the sanctuary. As the days passed in the silence of the tomb, the seeds would begin to stir, and a vibrant emerald carpet of young plants would grow from the figure's body, reaching toward the darkness. This was the vegetating Osiris, a living, breathing proof that life could emerge from the absolute stillness of death. To a grieving family, seeing the green shoots rising from the shape of the god was the ultimate reassurance that their own loved ones, too, would sprout into a new existence in the field of reeds. The arrival of the inundation, the Hapi, was seen as the physical return of Osiris's spirit to the thirsty land. As the water level rose, turning from a sluggish, stagnant green to a violent, silt-laden red, the people of Egypt did not hide in fear. They sang hymns of thanksgiving. They identified the flood with the god's own resurrection, a surge of divine energy that washed away the drought of the past year. It was commonly believed that the tears of Isis, shed during her long, agonizing search for her husband's scattered fragments, were the very source that caused the river to overflow its banks. The flood was a moment of theological joy, representing the unraveling of the dry, chaotic heat of Set and the triumph of the cool, moist order of Osiris. During this season, the entire landscape was transformed into a mirror of the primordial waters of Nun, the watery abyss from which all life originally emerged at the dawn of time. The connection between Osiris and the grain was so literal and so deep that the act of harvesting was seen as a sacred reenactment of his original dismemberment. When the farmer swung his bronze sickle to cut the heavy, golden stalks of wheat in the fields, he was symbolically performing the very act that Set had once committed in his blind rage. Yet, in the eyes of the Egyptians, this was a necessary and holy violence. The grain had to be cut, threshed, and ground into fine flour, so that it could become the bread that sustained the life of the people. The flail, which Osiris held in his mummified hands as a symbol of kingship, was originally an agricultural tool used to separate the grain from the chaff. It was a symbol of corrective discipline and purification, the profound idea that the soul, like the wheat, must be processed, tested, and refined before it can be offered to the gods. The suffering of the god was mirrored in the labor of the field, and the bounty of the table was a gift from his broken body. The transformation of the grain into beer and bread was also a sacred process, overseen by the watchful spirit of the god. Osiris was remembered as the one who had first taught humanity how to ferment the barley, creating a drink that was both a primary source of nutrition and a means of ritual celebration. In the daily temple rituals, the presentation of fresh bread was the most important offering, for it was seen as the most concentrated form of the god's own life force. Every loaf baked in the temple ovens, marked with the signs of the gods, was a tribute to the good being who had sacrificed his own physical integrity so that his people might never know the pangs of hunger. The baking process itself incorporated religious formulas recited during the mixing and the kneading, ensuring that the spiritual purity of the final product was maintained from the field to the altar. The green god was also recognized as the lord of the vineyards and the master of the vine. The dark, sweet wine of the delta was frequently compared to the blood of the god, a liquid fire that provided the worshipper with a brief glimpse into the ecstasy and the vibrancy of the divine realm. Just as the vine must be pruned back with iron, and the grapes must be crushed underfoot to release their hidden essence, the Egyptian believed that the soul had to undergo the trials of life and the transition of the Duat to release its true spiritual potential. This ecological theology meant that the people of the Nile lived in a world where every tree, every flowering plant, and every ripple in the moving water was a witness to the story of Osiris. They did not inhabit a secular or empty landscape. They lived within a living body of myths, where the environment was a constant dialogue with the divine. This deep and ancient connection to nature also explains why Osiris was so frequently and consistently associated with the cycles of the moon. Just as the moon waxes and wanes, growing to a brilliant fullness before being gradually eaten away by the shadows of the night, Osiris was born, flourished in his reign, was dismembered by his brother, and was eventually restored to a new form of glory. The 14 pieces of his body that Isis recovered were identified with the 14 days of the waning moon, the period when the light slowly vanishes from the sky until only the darkness of the new moon remains. The return of the first silver sliver of the new moon was the celestial signal of his resurrection, a promise written in the stars that the light would always return. This celestial rhythm provided a cosmic clock that mirrored the agricultural cycle of the earth and the biological cycle of the human body, creating a unified vision of time that was both linear and eternal. In the later periods of Egyptian history, this aspect of Osiris as the green god became even more prominent in the hearts of the people. They began to see him as the great soul of the world, the underlying energy that unified the celestial, terrestrial, and subterranean realms into a single, breathing whole. He was the force that made the stars move in their courses, the wind blow through the palms, and the hearts of men beat with the rhythm of Mut. The green of his skin was not just the color of plants. It was the color of eternity itself, a hue that represented the victory over the gray ash of the desert. As the priests performed the sacred opening of the mouth ritual on the mummies of the deceased, they were not just restoring the senses of an individual. They were reconnecting that person to the eternal green pulse of Osiris, ensuring they would sprout again in the fields of the afterlife. To the ancient Egyptian, there was no paralyzing fear in the changing of the seasons or the falling of the leaves, for they knew with absolute certainty that the winter was merely the period when Osiris slept in the quiet of his tomb. They knew that the spring would inevitably bring the inundation, the sprouting grain, and the joyful song of the birds in the marshes. They lived in a state of profound ecological confidence that is rare in the history of the world. They knew that as long as the laws of justice were upheld and the rituals were performed with a pure heart, the green god would return, the river would rise, and the cycle of life would continue forever. Death was not seen as a termination or a void. It was the sacred planting of a seed in the most fertile and loving soil of the universe. The story of Osiris and the Nile is a reminder that we are all part of a larger, breathing system. The food we eat, the water we drink, and the very air we breathe are all gifts from a source that has understood the necessity of sacrifice. Osiris taught the Egyptians that to live is to participate in a cycle of constant transformation. He showed them that even when the fields are dry and the river is low, the potential for life is still there, hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. As the modern traveler stands on the banks of the Nile today, watching the sun set over the green fringe of the valley, they are standing in the presence of the same mystery that defined the life of the pharaohs. The green god is still there, in the rustling of the sugarcane and the rising of the water, a silent witness to the eternal truth that nothing is ever truly lost, and that life in all its vibrant forms is the ultimate and final reality of the cosmos. Deep in the heart of Upper Egypt, where the limestone cliffs of the western desert curve away from the river in a protective embrace, lies the city of Abydos. To the ancient Egyptians, this was the most sacred spot on the surface of the earth, the physical point where the world of the living touched the realm of the dead with a unique and terrifying intensity. It was here, according to the oldest and most revered traditions, that the head of Osiris, the seat of his divine wisdom and royal authority, had been found and buried by the mourning Isis. Abydos was not merely a city of brick and stone. It was the great land, the gateway to the west, and the final destination of every soul that wished to achieve the status of a justified spirit. For 3,000 years, the road to Abydos was the most important pilgrimage route in the world, a path of deep devotion that defined the religious identity of the entire Nile Valley. The very dust of this city was considered sacred, and to walk upon its sun-bleached ground was to step directly into the eternal footprint of the god himself. The architecture of Abydos reflected its role as the absolute center of the Osirian cult. The great temple of Seti I, with its dark, subterranean chambers and its famous king list, was designed as a massive living house for the god's spirit. The limestone walls were decorated with relief carvings of such exquisite and lifelike detail that they seemed to pulse with a hidden vitality, depicting every single stage of the Osiris myth from his miraculous birth to his final assumption of the throne of the Underworld. Behind the main temple lay the Osirian, a mysterious and ancient structure built deep into the natural water table, designed to resemble the primordial mound of creation rising from the infinite waters of Nun. This was the symbolic tomb of the god, a place of absolute cooling stillness, where the good being rested in the darkness of the earth, surrounded by deep emerald waters that reflected the silence of eternity and the mystery of the first sunrise. The most important event in the religious calendar of Egypt was the great festival of Osiris, an annual reenactment of the god's life, death, and resurrection that drew thousands of people to the city. This was not a mere theatrical performance for entertainment. It was a sacred mystery that involved the entire community and drew pilgrims from every corner of the empire. The festival lasted for several days and was divided into 3 major acts, each one more profound and spiritually charged than the last. The first act was the going forth of Wep-Wawet, the wolf-headed god who was known as the opener of the ways. This deity acted as the vanguard for Osiris, clearing the path of any chaotic influences, malevolent shadows, or hostile spirits that might attempt to interfere with the sacred proceedings. The priests, dressed in elaborate wolf masks, led the way through the winding streets of the city, their movements precise and symbolic, creating a corridor of divine order through the crowded masses of people. The second act was the great procession of Osiris himself, the moment the entire city had been waiting for with bated breath. A magnificent statue of the god, carved from sacred wood and adorned with sheets of hammered gold and polished lapis lazuli, was carried out of the inner sanctuary and placed upon a ceremonial bark known as the Neshmet boat. This boat was not meant for the flowing waters of the river, but for the dry sands of the desert, and it was dragged by hundreds of devoted pilgrims and priests toward the ancient tomb of the god in the area known as el-Ka'ab. Along the way, groups of ritual actors and priestesses wearing masks, some representing the guardian Anubis, others the grieving sisters Isis and Nephthys, performed ritual battles against those portraying the followers of the chaotic Set. These were mock combats where the enemies of Osiris were symbolically defeated over and over again, reinforcing the triumph of order over chaos and life over death. The sounds of the clashing weapons and the rhythmic, deep chanting of the observers created an atmosphere of intense spiritual engagement that vibrated in the very air. The air during the festival was thick with the heavy, sweet scent of burning kifai, a complex incense made of 16 different ingredients, including raisins, wine, and wild honey, which was believed to facilitate the communication between the mortal and the divine realms. The sound of the sistrum, a rhythmic, metallic rattling instrument, filled the streets, its high-pitched vibrations intended to ward off malevolent spirits and attract the gentle attention of the gods. The pilgrims sang ancient hymns that described the suffering of the god and the overwhelming joy of his return, their collective voices echoing off of the desert cliffs in a roar of pure devotion. This shared experience of grief and eventual triumph unified the people, reminding every man and woman that their own individual lives were part of this grand cosmic cycle of renewal. The absolute climax of the mysteries took place in the secrecy of the tomb area, far from the eyes of the uninitiated or the casual observer. Here, in the dead of the desert night, the most sacred and secret rituals were performed by the high priests. The opening of the mouth ceremony was conducted on the statue of the god, symbolically restoring his divine senses and his ability to govern the afterlife with justice. This was a moment of profound cosmic importance, for it ensured that the Lord of the West remained active, breathing, and vigilant on behalf of the souls under his care. The priests used specialized tools forged from meteoric iron, the metal of heaven, to perform the delicate operations on the spiritual anatomy of the god. The silence of the desert night was broken only by the whispered spells of the high priests, their voices carrying the weight and the authority of thousands of years of unbroken tradition. For the ordinary Egyptian, the ultimate goal of their existence was to be buried at Abydos, or at least to have a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, constructed within the city's sacred boundaries. They believed with all their hearts that by being physically near the grave of the god, they would be among the first to be called by him during the final judgment in the Hall of Maat. The landscapes surrounding Abydos are littered with thousands of small stelae, votive stones, inscribed with the names of families who wish to be remembered by the god for all eternity. These stones typically show the deceased sitting before a table overflowing with offerings of bread, beer, and fowl, with an inscription requesting that Osiris grant them the sweet breath of the north wind and the ability to go forth by day. To have one's name carved into the permanent stone of Abydos was to ensure a piece of immortality in the shadow of the king. The waters of the sacred lake at Abydos were believed to have miraculous healing and purifying properties. Pilgrims would bathe in these waters, hoping to cure physical ailments or to purify their souls of the moral contagions and guilts acquired in the world of the living. The water was seen as the literal effluent of the god, a liquid essence that could bridge the gap between human frailty and divine perfection. Many pilgrims would take small ceramic vessels of this sacred water back to their distant homes, keeping it as a powerful, protective amulet against the forces of Set and the shadows of the night. The lake was a perfect mirror of the sky, and to enter its cool depths was to symbolically enter the celestial Nile that flowed through the heart of the underworld. As the centuries passed, the cult of Osiris at Abydos evolved into something even more personal, but its core remained the same. The belief in a god who had suffered as a human suffers, who had died a violent death, and who had nevertheless achieved an eternal and magnificent victory. This made Osiris the most accessible and deeply human of all the major Egyptian deities. He was the one who understood the pain of loss, the fear of the dark, and the weight of betrayal. The Abydos mysteries provided a structured and beautiful way for humanity to confront these universal experiences, transforming them into a journey of spiritual advancement and cosmic hope. The city became a sanctuary for the weary soul, a place where the finality of death was replaced by the eternal promise of the stars. The temple of Setiwe at Abydos remains today as one of the most evocative and haunting ruins in all of Egypt. Though the great crowds of pilgrims are gone, and the sistrums have long been silent, the atmosphere of the site still carries the immense weight of thousands of years of human devotion. The carvings of Osiris, his arms crossed over his chest in the sign of the king, his eyes fixed on the eternal horizon of the West, still speak to the fundamental human desire for a justice that transcends the grave. The Osirian, still partially flooded by the rising waters of the Nile, stands as a testament to the engineering and the absolute faith of a civilization that saw the entire world as a temple. To stand at Abydos is to stand at the heart of the Egyptian dream, the dream that no soul is ever truly lost, and that every heart, if it is light and pure enough, will eventually find its way back home to the presence of the green god. This pilgrimage to Abydos was the defining act of an Egyptian's life, whether they arrived by boat on the river or by caravan through the harsh desert. The first sight of the white pylons of the temple rising against the red cliffs was a moment of profound spiritual arrival. They brought with them the hopes of their ancestors and the prayers for their children, laying them at the feet of the Lord of eternity. They left behind their names, carved in stone or written on papyrus, as a permanent witness to their faith and their love for the fallen king. Osiris was the divine magnet that drew these millions of lives into a single unified narrative of resurrection. He was the king who had died so that they might live, and at Abydos, that sacrifice was celebrated with a beauty and a grandeur that has never been equaled in the history of religion. The silence of the city now is not the silence of the void, but the silence of a long, echoing prayer that has finally found its answer in the heart of the god. Every stone at Abydos has a story to tell, and every grain of sand has heard the hymns of the resurrected king. The mysteries performed here were the heartbeat of a nation, a reminder that even in the face of the most absolute darkness, there is a path back to the light. Osiris remains the silent host of this great land, welcoming every traveler who seeks the truth of the spirit. The rituals of the past were not just about a god who lived long ago. They were about the eternal present, the idea that every year, every day, and every moment is an opportunity for a new beginning. As the shadows lengthen over the ruins of the great temple, we can almost hear the rhythmic rattle of the sistrum and the soft footsteps of the pilgrims, moving together toward the tomb of the god who conquered death. As the centuries turned into millennia, and the political landscape of the Nile Valley began to shift under the influence of foreign empires, the figure of Osiris did not fade into the dust of history. Instead, he underwent a transformation that was as profound as his original resurrection. This was the era of the Ptolemies, the Greek successors of Alexander the Great, who sought to bridge the vast cultural and religious divide between their Hellenistic traditions and the ancient, deeply rooted faith of the Egyptian people. To achieve this, they turned to the most powerful symbol they could find, the Lord of the Underworld himself. But in this new world of sprawling libraries and Mediterranean trade, Osiris would take on a new name and a new form, becoming the god Serapis. This evolution was not a replacement of the old god, but an expansion of his essence, allowing his message of eternal life to reach ears that had never heard the name of the Black Land. The creation of Serapis was one of the most successful acts of religious syncretism in human history. The priests of Memphis and the scholars of Alexandria worked together to combine the attributes of Osiris with those of the sacred Apis bull, the living manifestation of Ptah. To this Egyptian foundation, they added the characteristics of the Greek gods Zeus, Hades, and Dionysus. The result was a deity who possessed the majesty of the King of the Heavens, the brooding authority of the Lord of the Dead, and the ecstatic, life-giving energy of the god of wine. Serapis was depicted no longer as a green-skinned mummy, but as a robust, bearded figure, with flowing hair, seated upon a throne, and wearing a modius, a grain measure, on his head. This crown was a direct reference to the ancient Osirian role as the provider of bread, but it also symbolized the abundance and the agricultural wealth that sustained the Mediterranean world. The Serapeum of Alexandria became the epicenter of this new cult, a temple of such architectural magnificence that it was often called the glory of the empire. Built upon a high artificial mound, the temple was filled with hundreds of marble columns and adorned with statues carved by the finest Greek masters. Beneath the sanctuary lay a labyrinth of subterranean passages and galleries, where the sacred bulls were buried in massive granite sarcophagi, maintaining the link to the ancient rituals of mummification. In the inner sanctum stood the colossal statue of Serapis, made of a mixture of precious metals and gems that shimmered in the dim light of the oil lamps. This was a god for a new age, a god who could be understood by a Greek philosopher in the Lyceum and an Egyptian farmer in the Delta. The cult of Serapis, and through him the legacy of Osiris, spread with a startling velocity. From the port of Alexandria, the god traveled across the sea on the merchant ships that carried Egyptian grain to the rest of the world. Temples dedicated to Serapis and his queen, Isis, began to appear in the great cities of Greece, in the busy markets of Ephesus, and eventually in the very heart of Rome itself. The Romans, who were fascinated by the antiquity and the mystery of the Egyptian faith, embraced the cult with a fervor that often alarmed their own traditionalist politicians. To the people of the Roman Empire, Serapis was the sole Invictus of the Underworld, the one who promised that the darkness of the grave was not a dead end, but a transition into a higher state of being. This international expansion of the cult highlighted the universal appeal of the Osirian narrative. The story of a god who had been betrayed, dismembered, and restored provided a powerful psychological anchor for people living in a world of constant political turmoil and social change. It offered a sense of personal salvation that was absent from the more civic-oriented religions of the Greeks and Romans. In the mystery cults of Serapis and Isis, the initiate underwent a symbolic death and rebirth, mirroring the journey of Osiris through the hours of the night. They were taught that by identifying themselves with the god's suffering, they could also share in his eternal victory. The secret rituals, performed in the depths of the temples, were designed to produce a state of spiritual ecstasy, a direct encounter with the divine that bypassed the need for earthly intermediaries. The imagery of Serapis also incorporated the three-headed dog, Cerberus, who sat at his feet. In the Egyptian context, this was a Hellenistic interpretation of the various guardians of the Duat, including the devourer Ammit. This fusion of symbols showed how the specific geography of the Egyptian underworld was being translated into a broader, more universal vocabulary of the afterlife. The scales of Ma'at were still present in the hearts of the worshippers, but they were now seen as a universal moral law that governed all of humanity, not just the people of the Nile. Osiris Serapis was the judge of every soul, regardless of their language or their place of birth. Despite these foreign layers, the traditional Egyptian priesthood continued to maintain the ancient ways in the temples of Upper Egypt. In places like Edfu and Philae, Osiris was still worshipped in his original form, and the annual mysteries were performed with a strict adherence to the texts of the Old Kingdom. There was a fascinating duality to the religion of this period: a public, international face of the god in the north, and a private, traditional face in the south. These two versions of the god supported each other, ensuring that the legacy of Osiris survived, even as the power of the pharaohs faded into memory. The priests of the south saw themselves as the guardians of the original spark, the ones who kept the flame of the first time burning in an increasingly crowded and complicated world. The influence of Osiris also extended into the early developments of other faiths. Many of the titles and the iconographic elements associated with the Lord of the West, the Good Shepherd, the King of Kings, the one who rose from the dead on the third day, resonated deeply with the emerging religious movements of the Eastern Mediterranean. The image of Isis holding the infant Horus in the marshes of the Delta provided a powerful visual archetype for the concept of divine motherhood and the protection of the innocent. These resonances were not direct copies, but a shared spiritual language that the myth of Osiris had helped to establish over 3,000 years. The human experience of death and the hope for a future life had been so thoroughly defined by the Osirian tradition that any new expression of faith had to engage with its concepts. The eventual decline of the formal temples of Serapis and Osiris did not happen overnight. It was a slow, agonizing process that occurred as the Roman Empire transitioned into a new era of religious exclusivity. The Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, which established a single state religion, signaled the end of the public festivals and the closure of the ancient sanctuaries. The Serapeum of Alexandria, once the pride of the city, was destroyed, and the great library that was associated with it was lost to the flames of history. Yet, even as the marble statues were broken and the hieroglyphs were forgotten by the masses, the essence of Osiris remained. He had become part of the collective unconscious of the world. The story of Osiris as a civilizer, a martyr, and a judge had been told for so long that it had become a permanent part of the human soul. The belief that the universe is governed by a moral law, that the heart is the seat of the soul's worth, and that life continues in a realm beyond the physical, are all ideas that find their most ancient and complete expression in his myth. He was the first to show that the grave is not a prison, but a womb. The Hellenistic transformation into Serapis allowed these ideas to travel far beyond the borders of Egypt, planting the seeds of Assyrian hope in the soil of every land, from the shores of the Atlantic to the mountains of India. As we look back at the shadow of the Ptolemies, we see not the end of a god, but the birth of a universal legacy that continues to influence our understanding of the mystery of death and the promise of what lies beyond. In the final hour of the night, when the dim light of the Duat begins to fade into the absolute clarity of the celestial realm, the story of Osiris reaches its ultimate and most magnificent destination. We have followed him from his birth on the epagomenal days, through his civilizing reign on earth, his brutal betrayal by Set, and his meticulous restoration by the hands of Anubis and Isis. We have stood before his throne in the hall of two truths and witnessed the weighing of the heart. But the Egyptian mind did not see the afterlife as a static existence in a subterranean chamber. The ultimate hope was to transcend the earth entirely, to leave behind the mud of the Nile and the shadows of the caverns, and to ascend to the imperishable stars that circle the northern pole. This is the final transformation of Osiris, his identification with the constellation of Orion, the great hunter of the heavens. The connection between Osiris and the stars is found in the oldest layers of the pyramid texts, carved into the stone walls of the burial chambers over 4,000 years ago. These texts describe the soul of the king rising like a bird from the pyramid's apex, shedding its mortal weight and taking its place among the stars. The constellation of Orion was known to the Egyptians as Sa, and his companion, the bright star Sirius, was Sopdet, or the goddess Isis. Just as Osiris and Isis were inseparable on Earth, they were reunited in the celestial sky. Every night, Orion rises in the south, his belt formed of 3 perfect stars, appearing to chase the darkness across the firmament. To the Egyptians, this was not just a collection of lights. It was the physical body of Osiris, glorified and eternal, watching over the world he had once ruled. This stellar theology gave the people of the Nile a sense of cosmic belonging. They believed that every individual possessed a Sahu, an incorruptible spirit body that could achieve a place among the imperishable ones. The Great Pyramid of Giza, perhaps the most iconic structure in human history, was built with this stellar journey in mind. The narrow shafts that lead from the king's chamber were not merely for ventilation. They were oriented with surgical precision toward the stars of Orion's belt. They were spiritual launch pads, designed to allow the soul of the pharaoh to shoot directly toward the heart of Osiris in the heavens. This was the ultimate victory over death, to become a star, a light that would never be extinguished by the passage of time or the whims of chaos. The identification of Osiris with Orion also linked him back to the agricultural cycles of the earth. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the appearance of the star on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, signaled the beginning of the Nile's inundation. When Isis Sopdet appeared in the sky, it was the message that her husband Osiris was about to return to the land in the form of the floodwaters. The cosmos and the earth were in a state of perfect resonance. The movements of the stars were the movements of the gods, and the lives of humans were woven into this grand celestial pattern. There was no such thing as a random event. Everything from the sprouting of a grain of wheat to the death of a king was part of the story of Osiris. As we reach the conclusion of this narrative, we must reflect on the enduring silence of Osiris. Throughout the thousands of spells and hymns dedicated to him, he rarely speaks. He does not offer long sermons or complex commandments. His power lies in his state of being. He is the quiet one, the still heart. He represents the peace that comes after the struggle, the order that emerges after the storm. He is the answer to the fundamental human anxiety about the end of our individual stories. By undergoing the most horrific of all ends, betrayal and dismemberment, and emerging as the Lord of eternity, he proved that no trauma is too great for the soul to overcome. He is the personification of the human capacity for resilience, and the belief that justice is the underlying fabric of the universe. The legacy of Osiris is found in the very concept of the Osiris NN. In the Book of the Dead, every soul that entered the underworld was addressed as the Osiris of the person's name. This meant that every human being, regardless of their status, had the potential to become a god. By following the path of Osiris, they could transform their mortality into immortality. This was the greatest democratization of the divine in human history. It suggested that divinity was not a distant, unreachable quality, but a latent potential within the human heart. The weighing of the heart was the process of revealing that potential. If the heart was light, it was because it had become a reflection of the divine order. The world of ancient Egypt is now a world of ruins and whispers. The temples of Abydos and Philae are silent, and the waters of the Nile are managed by modern engineering rather than the tears of a goddess. The golden chests and the alabaster tables of the embalmers are now museum artifacts, and the hieroglyphs are a language learned by scholars in libraries far from the valley. Yet, every time we look up at the belt of Orion on a clear winter night, we are looking at the same sight that the priests of Heliopolis saw 5,000 years ago. Every time we feel the hope that a loss can be healed, or that a life can have meaning beyond its physical span, we are feeling the echo of the Osirian promise. Osiris is the green of the spring, the black of the fertile soil, and the white of the funeral shroud. He is the king who fell, and the god who rose. His story is a journey from the womb of the sky goddess to the throne of the underworld, and finally to the imperishable stars of the northern sky. It is a story that teaches us that life is a cycle, that love is stronger than death, and that truth is the only thing that weighs nothing in the balance of eternity. As the sun sets once more in the west, and the stars of Orion begin their nightly patrol of the heavens, we leave the Lord of the West to his silent vigil. He is the beginning and the end, the first and the last, the Lord of all that was, all that is, and all that will ever be. Thank you for joining me on this immersive journey into the heart of ancient Egypt. If you found peace and curiosity in the story of Osiris, please consider subscribing to Hearths of Myths and liking this video to help our community of legends grow. May your journey through the hours of the night be guided by the light of the stars, and may your heart always be as light as a feather. Until we meet again in the hall of another myth, sleep deeply and stay curious.